The Galactic Council mocked humanity, then Earth went silent. The laughter hit me before the translation even finished loading. I was standing at the central podium of the Grand Convocation Hall, the most powerful political chamber in the known galaxy, and I was being laughed at. Not quietly, not politely. The sound came from every corner of that enormous room, in frequencies some human ears could not even fully process. Low rumbles from the Vreth delegation. High, rapid clicking from the Surin cluster representatives. A cascade of pulsing color flashes from the Luminari, which, I had been told, was their version of amusement. My name is Kale Marin. I was 41 years old, a career diplomat, and I had spent 6 years preparing for this moment. 6 years of language study, of cultural briefings, of practicing how to stand still under pressure. I had read every known record of alien diplomacy. I had memorized the Council's procedural rules. I had rehearsed my presentation in 11 languages, including 2 that required a secondary vocal apparatus I did not have, so I used a translation device instead. None of that preparation had included a section titled What to Do when an entire alien parliament laughs at you. The Grand Convocation Hall was built inside a hollowed asteroid, reinforced and pressurized to accommodate 47 different atmospheric preferences simultaneously. The ceiling was so high that clouds formed naturally near the top. The seating tiers curved upward in a vast bowl, each section adjusted for gravity, temperature, and light to suit whatever species occupied it. From where I stood at the central podium, it looked like a living mosaic of color, shape, and motion. And every part of that mosaic was, in that moment, laughing at Earth. The trigger had been Elder Counselor Dron of the Vreth. The Vreth were the oldest and most influential species in the Council, insected in structure, with layered compound eyes that reflected light in shifting gold and green patterns. Dron had read Earth's membership application aloud slowly, with deliberate pauses at every section that seemed to amuse him. He paused longest at our recorded history of internal conflicts. He paused at our atmospheric damage reports. He paused at our average biological lifespan, which, compared to many Council species, was remarkably short. Then he had said, in a voice that carried without effort across the entire chamber, the human species requests full membership in the Galactic Council on the grounds that they have achieved interstellar travel, established 3 off-world colonies, and demonstrated in their words a commitment to peaceful cooperation. Another pause. This application was submitted 63 years after their first successful faster-than-light transit. By comparison, the Vreth had 17 colony systems and 2 trade federations at the same point in our development. The Surin had established diplomatic contact with 4 neighboring species. Even the Pelori, who are generally regarded as a slow-developing civilization, had formed a planetary defense coalition. He looked at me with those golden compound eyes. Humanity has formed committees. That was when the laughter started. I held still. My hands were behind my back. My expression was professional. Inside, I felt something tighten in my chest, but I did not let it reach my face. I had been chosen for this posting partly because of my ability to maintain composure, and I intended to honor that. Dron continued after the noise faded. He went through the application point by point. He noted our resource extraction practices. He noted our population's historical tendency toward internal division. He noted that our fastest ship took 11 months to reach the nearest star system, which he described as charmingly primitive. He noted our average technological development timeline and compared it unfavorably to 6 other species in the room. By the time he finished, the application had been reduced to something that sounded less like a milestone and more like a child presenting a crayon drawing to a gallery of professional artists. The vote was called. The result was not close. 41 against, 4 abstentions, 2 in favor, both of them small, younger species who had been admitted to the Council only within the last century and perhaps remembered what it felt like to stand at that podium. Earth's application for full council membership was denied. We were reclassified. The new designation was provisional curiosity, a category I had never encountered in my research because it was, I later discovered, rarely used. It had been created generations ago for species that showed enough development to be worth monitoring but not enough to warrant serious diplomatic engagement. We were not allies. We were not threats. We were not even rivals. We were interesting in the way that a new insect species might be interesting to a biologist. Dron delivered the summary verdict with the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. He said, "Humans are remarkable only in how much noise they make for how little time they have existed." The hall offered a murmur of agreement. I thanked the council for their time. I gathered my documents. I walked out of that chamber at a measured pace, neither fast nor slow, and I did not look back. In my quarters on the station, I filed my report to Earth. I used precise, formal language. I described the vote, the classification, the stated reasoning. I included a full transcript of Dron's remarks. I attached my assessment of council sentiment and my recommendations for the diplomatic path forward, which included several options ranging from reapplication in 10 years to a formal appeal process. Then I waited. The response came in 14 hours, which accounted for transmission delay. It was shorter than I expected. There was no anger in it, no instructions to protest, no demands for a formal complaint, no direction to request a review, just a single paragraph from the Office of Interplanetary Affairs. It read, "Report acknowledged. Thank you for your service, Ambassador Marin. Adjusting strategy accordingly. Continue your posting and report any significant council developments. No further action required at this time." I read it 3 times. No further action required. I set the message down and looked out the small viewport in my quarters. The neutron star that the station orbited was a faint, dense point of light in the distance, surrounded by the slow drift of debris from the asteroid field. It was not a beautiful view exactly, but it was vast. I had expected anger. I had expected demands, debates, press announcements. Back home, political setbacks of far smaller magnitude had generated months of heated public response. I had expected Earth to be wounded by this, loudly and visibly. Instead, there was a calm that I could not quite interpret. I checked the civilian news feeds from Earth that evening. There was coverage of the vote, factual and measured. A few opinion pieces. Some public commentary, predictably mixed, but nothing like the outrage I had anticipated. No mass protests outside government buildings. No emergency sessions being called. No dramatic speeches from world leaders. There was one government broadcast that played on a loop across all major networks for about 6 hours. It was brief. A single spokesperson, standing in front of no particular backdrop, reading a prepared statement. The statement said that Earth had received the Council's decision, that it had been noted, and that humanity was proceeding with its long-term development plans as scheduled. As scheduled. I went to sleep that night with a feeling I could not name. It was not quite unease. It was not quite pride. It was something in between, something that sat quietly in the back of my thoughts without announcing itself. In the morning, I went back to work. I attended council observation sessions. I filed my regular reports. I exchanged polite, minimal interactions with other species ambassadors who largely treated me with the diplomatic equivalent of tolerance. Life on Sector Prime continued as normal. For a while. 8 months passed before the first transmission failed. I noticed it on a Tuesday, which I still tracked by Earth calendar out of habit. The scheduled diplomatic frequency from Earth came up empty. No signal, no message, just the quiet background noise of open space. I logged it as a potential equipment fault and submitted a technical request to the station's communications team. The team reported no issues on their end. I requested a second contact attempt. Nothing. I told myself it was a relay issue. The deep space communication network that humanity maintained was good but not perfect. Disruptions happened. I had seen 3 similar gaps in the past 6 years, always resolved within a week. This one did not resolve. By the end of that week, 2 more scheduled contacts had passed without response. I upgraded my concern level and submitted a formal report to the Council's administrative office, noting that Earth's communication had gone dark and requesting that it be logged for the record. The administrator who received my report was a Surin named Vale, small and quick-moving, with a multifaceted attentiveness that I had always found either charming or exhausting depending on my mood. Vale looked at my report, looked at me, and said, with genuine but mild sympathy, "It may be a solar event. Your star is rather active. We can flag it in the system." "Thank you," I said. Vale flagged it and moved on. The Council had 47 member species and a schedule of proceedings that filled every day. Earth going quiet was a footnote. But I kept watching. The next signal to go dark was not a diplomatic frequency. It was a commercial trade beacon. Humanity had placed a series of automated beacons along its main shipping corridor, broadcasting standard identification and navigation data. It was routine infrastructure, the kind of thing that ran without anyone actively managing it. Those beacons did not go silent unless something had physically removed them or disabled them from the source. One went dark, then another, then 4 more within the span of 2 weeks. I started keeping a separate personal log, distinct from my official reports. I told myself it was simply for organizational clarity, but the truth was that I was beginning to think things I did not want to put in an official document until I understood them better. I tried to contact Earth through every channel I had: the diplomatic line, the emergency frequency, the civilian relay network that connected to public broadcast systems, the research institution contacts I had built up over years of secondary communication. Every line returned the same answer. Not static, not interference, not the kind of noise that comes from a broken transmitter. Just absence. Clean, complete, total silence. It was the kind of silence that does not happen by accident. I reported to the Council again. I requested that it be elevated from a footnote to a formal concern. The session was brief. A junior Vreth counselor named Heese, who handled what the Council called developing species matters, reviewed my report, and offered the Council's official assessment in a tone that I had come to recognize as the diplomatic version of a dismissal. "Civilizations at Earth's developmental stage," he said, "experience periodic crises that can interrupt external communication, resource conflicts, environmental emergencies, internal political instability. In recorded Council history, there are 14 cases of pre-membership species going silent for periods ranging from several months to several decades. Of those 14, 11 eventually re-established contact. The remaining 3 experienced events that prevented further development." He paused for what might have been a moment of professional sympathy. "We recommend continued monitoring. If there is no contact within 2 standard years, the Council will send an observation team." 2 years? I sat with that for a long moment, and in the meantime, I asked. "In the meantime, Ambassador, you are welcome to continue your posting. We will maintain the log entry." I walked back to my quarters with a very specific kind of frustration that I had learned, over years of diplomatic work, to keep entirely off my face. Once the door was closed, I sat down and opened my personal log. The entry I wrote that evening was short. I stared at it for a while before saving it. 3 Vreth scout ships had been dispatched toward Earth's solar system approximately 3 weeks prior. I had not been officially informed of this. I had learned about it through a piece of incidental conversation between 2 low-level Council staffers who had not realized I was within earshot. The ships had been sent under the heading of routine developmental monitoring, which was Council language for keeping an eye on species that had been classified as provisional curiosities. Those 3 scout ships had also stopped transmitting. I had not put that in my official report yet. I needed to be sure. I spent 2 days quietly verifying it through indirect sources, cross-referencing fleet logs that were technically public record, checking transit schedules that the Vreth delegation filed as procedural documentation. By the end of those 2 days, I was sure. 3 Vreth ships, sent toward Earth's solar system, had gone silent at almost the exact same point in their journey, approximately 4 light hours from the edge of the Sol system. Not at the same moment, because they had been traveling at different speeds on slightly different approach vectors. But each one had gone quiet at almost precisely the same distance from Earth. And then a Surin observation post, a small automated station that had been sitting near the outer edge of Earth's solar neighborhood for about 30 years, collecting passive data, had also gone dark. I sat very still at my desk in the dim light of my quarters and thought about that for a long time. The Council's official interpretation, had I brought this to their attention formally, would have been some variation of equipment malfunction or local spatial anomaly. That was how institutions handled data that did not fit their existing frameworks. They found a category that made the data feel manageable, filed it appropriately, and moved on. But I had been a diplomat for 18 years, and one of the first things you learn in that profession is how to tell the difference between a problem that looks controlled and a problem that is controlled. Earth's silence was controlled. I did not know how I knew that with such certainty, but I did. It had a shape to it. It had edges. It was not the random, spreading silence of a civilization in distress. It was the deliberate, precise silence of something that had chosen not to speak. I thought about that government broadcast, the one that had played on a loop for 6 hours after the Council's vote. The calm spokesperson, the measured tone, the phrase that had stayed with me. Proceeding with long-term development plans as scheduled. And then I thought about something I had noticed at the time but not given enough weight to. In the civilian news feeds from Earth, in the weeks following the vote, the public commentary had shifted. There had been an early wave of frustration, which was expected, but it had faded faster than any comparable political event in Earth's recent history. It had not been suppressed, because the feeds remained active and the range of opinions visible. It had simply faded, replaced by something that did not read as resignation or defeat, but as something harder to name. Focus, maybe, or purpose. I wrote in my log that night, "Something is happening. I do not think Earth is dying. I think Earth is working, and I think they decided not to tell us what they were working on." I saved the entry and stared at the viewport for a long time. Outside, the neutron star turned in the dark, and the asteroid field drifted slowly past, and somewhere beyond the reach of every instrument on the station, in a solar system that had gone completely, deliberately, carefully quiet, humanity was doing something. I did not know what. I was not sure the Council was going to like finding out. Her name was Saris, and she found me, not the other way around. I had seen her at Council sessions before. The Luminari were hard to miss. They were beings of structured light, their forms held in coherent shapes by fields that human science was still working to fully understand. Saris presented herself as a tall column of soft gold and pale white, with brighter concentrations that served as focal points for attention, which was how I understood she was looking at me. She had the reputation of a researcher and a technical analyst, not a politician. She approached me in one of the station's secondary corridors, at a time and in a location that I later realized she had chosen specifically because it had no active surveillance. She said, without any greeting, "I need to show you something, privately, and you need to decide very quickly whether you want to see it, because once you do, you cannot unknow it." I looked at her for a moment. "Is this an official communication?" "It is the opposite of an official communication," she said. I told her I would hear it. She took me to a section of Sector Prime that I had never visited, a research annex on the outer ring of the station that was technically accessible to credentialed staff, but practically empty, because most of the work conducted there had migrated to a newer facility in a different section years ago. The equipment was older. The lighting was dimmer, and there were no other people in the corridors we walked through. Saris pulled up a data array on a display surface that looked like it had not been used in some time. She had clearly prepared what she wanted to show me. The files were already loaded, already queued. One of the 3 Vreth scout ships, she said, transmitted a fragmented data packet before it went silent. The signal was partial, corrupted by whatever caused the contact loss. It reached a relay station and was filed in the Council's Deep Space Event Archive as an unresolved anomaly. She paused. I accessed it. Is that permitted? I asked. It is technically within my research clearance, she said, which was not quite an answer to the question I had asked. She brought up the first fragment. It was a partial visual scan from the ship's forward observation array. The image quality was poor, broken in sections, with chunks of data simply missing, but what was visible was enough to make me stop breathing for a moment. The image showed Earth's solar system, not as I knew it from the navigation charts I had studied for years, not as the familiar arrangement of planets and debris fields that humanity had been carefully cataloging since the invention of the telescope. Something had changed. The asteroid belt was gone. Not gone as in cleared by some natural event. Gone as in removed. The region where millions of rocks had drifted in their slow orbits for billions of years was now a different kind of structure. The fragments that remained were moving in coordinated patterns, and the space between them was filled with geometric frameworks so large that the scout ship's visual array had captured only a fraction of them before the signal broke apart. How large? I said. My voice was quieter than I intended. Based on the scale reference from the ship's own position, Saris said, the smallest structure visible in that fragment is approximately 900 kilometers in length. I sat down without meaning to. She continued. The second fragment was from a different sensor array showing the area closer to the sun. This image was even more damaged, but a shape was discernible near the inner system. A structure around the sun itself. Not complete, not yet, but in progress, which was somehow more astonishing than if it had been finished. A Dyson structure, I said. Partial, she said. Perhaps 12 to 18% complete based on the shadow pattern. Though I have to be honest with you, the math I am using to estimate that was designed for analysis of naturally occurring phenomena. I may be significantly underestimating the scale. And Mars. She brought up the third fragment. Mars was still in the right orbital position, which was somehow reassuring, as if I needed at least one familiar reference point. But its surface was not the cold red terrain I had seen in every photograph from Earth's early space program. It was covered in something. The resolution was not enough to tell me exactly what, but the color pattern and the geometry of what was visible from orbit strongly suggested construction, not habitation. Something more systematic than that. When did this start? I asked. Based on the orbital mechanics of the structures visible in these fragments, and cross-referencing with the last confirmed normal observation data from the Surin post before it went offline, Saris said. The large-scale visible construction began approximately 5 months after the Council's vote on Earth's membership application. 5 months. I looked at the fragmented images on the display, and I tried to organize my thoughts, because they were moving in several directions at once, and I needed them to form a single line. Humanity had gone silent not because of a collapse, not because of a crisis, not because something had gone wrong. Humanity had gone silent because humanity had made a decision, species-wide, apparently unanimous in its practical effect, to stop talking and start building. 5 months after being told by the most powerful political body in the galaxy that they were not worth taking seriously. They did not announce it, I said. It was not a question. No external communication of any kind, Sarah said. Not to the council, not to any independent observer station, not even the standard navigational hazard broadcasts that spacefaring civilizations are generally expected to maintain for the safety of other ships in transit. That last point is what concerns me, I said. And me, she said, but not for the reason you might think. What concerns me is not the hazard. What concerns me is the message. Switching off the navigational broadcasts was not an accident. It was a statement. I thought about that, stay out. Or perhaps more precisely, she said, we are not concerned with you right now. We are busy. We looked at the damaged images together for a moment in silence. Does anyone else on the council know about this fragment? I asked. The archive entry exists, she said. Anyone with appropriate clearance could access it, but it is filed as an unresolved anomaly from a malfunctioning ship, which means it is in a low-priority queue that nobody actively monitors. I only found it because I was specifically looking. Why were you looking? She was quiet for a moment, and her light shifted in a way I had come to recognize as something like discomfort. Because I was at the session where the vote was taken, I watched your species be dismissed, and I have been a technical researcher for a long time, and I have reviewed a great many cases of civilizations in difficulty and civilizations in progress. She paused. Earth's silence did not feel like difficulty to me. It felt like something else. I wanted to know if I was right. You were right, I said. I know, she said, and that is why I am afraid. I understood what she meant. She was not afraid of humanity. Or rather, she was not afraid of humanity in the way that a person fears something dangerous. She was afraid in the way that a careful thinker becomes afraid when reality turns out to be larger than the framework they were using to understand it. The Galactic Council had spent centuries operating on a set of assumptions about the order of things, about which civilizations mattered and which ones were background noise. Those assumptions were the foundation of every policy, every classification, every vote. If Earth had just done what those fragments suggested it had done, in the time it had taken to do it, then those assumptions were not just wrong. They were dangerously, completely, foundationally wrong. The Council is going to send a fleet, I said. Yes, she said. I believe the Vreth are already preparing one. The loss of their scout ships is being treated as an incident requiring a response. The current debate in the Security Subcommittee is about the appropriate scale of the response. How large? The last estimate I heard mentioned was 200 vessels. I closed my eyes for a moment. I had spent 18 years as a diplomat. I had negotiated trade disputes and border agreements and cultural protection treaties and resource allocation frameworks. I had talked people down from positions they had taken in anger and guided parties toward agreements they had convinced themselves were impossible. I had, in my professional career, prevented 3 situations from becoming what could fairly be called serious crises, though none of them had ever been officially acknowledged as such. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that sending 200 ships toward Earth right now was the single worst decision the Council could make. Not because of what Earth might do to those ships. I did not know what Earth would do. I did not know what Earth was capable of now, which was itself a terrifying thought for someone who had grown up believing he understood his own species reasonably well. I was afraid of what 200 ships would represent, what it would communicate, what it would confirm from Earth's perspective about everything the Council had already demonstrated it believed about humanity. I went to the Council. I requested an emergency audience with the Security Subcommittee. I presented my concerns. I used careful, measured language. I explained that sending a large military formation toward a species that had gone silent was unlikely to produce useful information and very likely to produce a situation that was difficult to walk back from. I recommended instead a single diplomatic vessel, unarmed, with a formal communication requesting an open channel. The subcommittee listened politely. They thanked me for my perspective. They overruled me. Walking back from that session, I stopped in the corridor outside the main chamber and stood very still for a moment. Then I took out my personal log and wrote a single line. They are sending 200 ships. I asked them not to. I know my people. You do not knock on that door with a fist and expect a polite answer. I saved it and kept walking. 200 ships were leaving for Earth's solar system, and I had run out of arguments to stop them. I only hoped that whoever was on the other side of that silence had enough patience left for one more miscalculation from people who had already made too many. The feed was live. The council chamber had been arranged for a full session, every tier occupied, every delegation present. This did not happen often. The Grand Convocation Hall was used for major votes and formal proceedings, but not typically for real-time event monitoring. The fact that it had been assembled this way told me how much the Vreth wanted this to be witnessed. A demonstration of council authority, a moment of collective power shared across 47 species. I sat in the human observation section, which was a small alcove near the lower tier, and I watched the central display. The fleet was 212 ships, as it turned out. 12 additional vessels had been added in the final planning stages, mostly communications and support craft. They had been traveling for 19 days. The approach to Sol system was visible on the display as a cluster of green indicators moving slowly across a mapped field, each ship broadcasting its standard identification signal. The whole formation organized in a pattern that the Vreth described as an inquiry formation, but which, to any honest eye, looked like what it was. The lead ship opened a transmission channel as the fleet crossed what the navigation team had designated as the outer monitoring threshold. The channel was addressed to Earth, broadcast on all known human communication frequencies. The message was formal, controlled, and in its careful phrasing, unmistakably a demand dressed in procedural language. This is Grand Fleet Commander Orith of the Vreth Sovereign Navigation Corps, acting under the authority of the Galactic Council. We are requesting immediate communication with the governing authority of the human species. Please confirm receipt and respond. The chamber waited. 47 species, thousands of individuals in complete silence watching the display. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. Then a signal came back from the Sol system. The translation loaded faster than I expected, which meant it had been prepared in advance. It was not in the Vreth's language. It was not in the Council's official diplomatic standard. It was in every language of every species currently represented in that chamber, all 47, simultaneously layered and individually addressed, so that each delegation heard it in their own tongue without any processing delay. The voice was calm, not cold, not threatening, just calm in the way that a person is calm when they have already considered every possible version of this conversation and decided how they want it to go. This system is under reconstruction. Non-hostile vessels may observe from beyond the heliopause. Hostile approach will be met with a response proportional to intent. We hope you choose observation. We are prepared for either. Earth Unified Directorate. The chamber reacted. I heard the sound of it, layered and multi-frequency, a kind of collective intake of breath that each species expressed differently, but that all meant the same thing. On the display, the fleet indicators paused. Commander Orith, to his credit as a military professional if not as a diplomat, did not hesitate for long. 12 seconds after the message was received, the fleet resumed its approach vector. Not full speed. A measured advance, formation tight, weapons systems on what the Council's tactical display was reading as standby rather than active engagement. But moving forward. I watched the display. My hands were flat on the surface of the observation alcove in front of me. I was aware that I was holding my breath and I made myself stop doing that. The fleet crossed what the navigational display labeled the outer heliopause boundary. Nothing happened. They continued inward, Another light minute of distance closed. Then another. The chamber's ambient noise had dropped to almost nothing. Even the species that communicated through sound were quiet now. At a distance I estimated to be approximately where the destroyed Vreth scout ships had gone silent, the fleet's indicators on the display did something that no tactical display in the history of Council military operations had apparently ever shown before, because I heard a Vreth technical officer in the row behind me make a sound that I had never heard a Vreth make in all my years on the station. The indicator stopped moving. Not destruction, not dispersal, not the sudden scattered pattern that would indicate ships taking evasive action. They simply stopped, all 212 of them, at exactly the same moment, in their exact formation, geometry preserved perfectly, as if they had been placed there by a careful hand and told not to move. The communication systems on the lead ship were still active. Commander Orith's voice came through the feed, and for the first time in this entire transmission, I could hear something in it that had not been there before. Not panic, not anger, something quieter than either of those. All engines are non-responsive, all weapon systems are offline, environmental systems are functioning, life support is stable, we are stationary, we are, a brief pause, being held. The chamber noise came back, all at once, every frequency, every species, every sound of surprise and fear and disbelief layering over each other, until the translation system simply could not keep up with all of it and started prioritizing by intensity. On the display, 212 ships sat motionless in perfect formation, held in space, as gently and completely as objects in a museum case. They were held for 1 hour. I know it was exactly 1 hour because I counted. I watched the timer on the display. I watched the council chamber around me, and I watched the faces and forms and bioluminescent patterns and sonic emissions of 47 species learning something about the universe that they had not known before, in real time, in the most public possible setting that could have been chosen for such a lesson. During that hour, no one from Earth communicated further. No threats, no demands, no explanations, just silence and the image of 212 ships sitting perfectly still in the dark. At the exact moment the hour ended, the fleet's indicators on the display began to move again, not in their approach vector. Outward, back toward the Council's space, every ship under its own power, its systems restored as completely and as precisely as they had been disabled. As the last ship cleared the heliopause, a second transmission arrived. The same voice, the same calm, still in all 47 languages. We trust that was sufficient. You are welcome to send a diplomat, only one, unarmed. We suggest you send the human, Earth Unified Directorate. The chamber was the quietest I had ever heard it. I did not move for a long moment. I was aware that every delegation near my section had turned to look at me, not with the casual dismissal I had grown accustomed to over 8 months, but with something different. Something I had to take a moment to correctly identify, because I had not seen it directed at a human face in this chamber before. Uncertainty. They did not know what to make of this. And because they did not know, and I was the only human in the room, they were looking at me as though I might. The council session resumed in a chaotic way that I had never witnessed before. Multiple delegations were attempting to speak simultaneously. The Vreth contingent, normally the most controlled and procedurally precise group in the chamber, was visibly fractured. Elder Counselor Dran, sitting in his elevated seat, was no longer performing the composed authority that was his professional signature. He was still. Very still, in the way that a person goes still when they are processing something that does not fit any category they have prepared for. I was eventually called to the floor. Counselor Heese, the junior Vreth who handled developing species matters, was the one who called me down. There was something almost mechanical in his voice now, like a person reading from a script they no longer entirely believed in. Ambassador Marin, he said. "The Council would like to understand the nature of the technology displayed by your species today, the intent behind this demonstration, and the terms under which further contact might proceed." I stood at the podium where I had stood 8 months ago. The chamber was fuller now and quieter. I thought about what to say for a moment that probably felt long to the people watching me. "I will be honest with you," I said at last. "I have been out of contact with Earth for 8 months. I have not been briefed on their current capabilities, their current priorities, or the terms they intend to propose. I know my people the way any individual knows their home, through history and culture and instinct and memory, but I cannot speak for an Earth I have not spoken to." I paused. "What I can tell you is this. You dismissed humanity not because you evaluated us carefully and found us lacking. You dismissed humanity because we were young, and because young civilizations are easy to dismiss when you have been powerful for a long time. You made your decision before the evidence was complete, and what you saw today is some portion of that evidence." The chamber was completely silent. "You asked me what my people want," I said. "I genuinely do not know, but I think that is precisely the point. You assumed you knew what we were. You assumed the story was already written. Now you will have to ask." I stepped back from the podium. Elder Dran was still looking at me. I held his gaze, those layered compound eyes with their shifting gold-green reflection, and I did not look away. He did not laugh. 19 days is a long time when you are traveling towards something you do not fully understand. My vessel was a single diplomatic courier, the smallest class of ship with an official council designation, unarmed by design and by inspection. I had been given a formal letter of introduction from the council, drafted by committee and therefore careful to say almost nothing in a great many words. I had my personal effects, my communication equipment, and a data archive of everything I had gathered over the past 8 months. And I had a lot of time to think. I wrote in my log every day, not the official log, which I maintained in the dry, professional language of diplomatic reporting. The personal one, the one I had started keeping when Earth's transmissions first went dark. It had grown into something I had not planned for it to be, something closer to a letter than a record, not addressed to anyone in particular. Or perhaps addressed to everyone in a general kind of way, the way a person writes when they want to be honest and have run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. I wrote about the council session, about the silence of the chamber during that 1 hour when 212 ships sat still in space, about Dran's face, which I had watched more carefully than almost anything else in that room. I wrote about what it means to laugh at something you do not understand. I thought about the history I had studied before taking this posting, all those years of Earth looking outward, learning that the galaxy was occupied, navigating the first cautious contacts, building toward the moment when we sent a representative to stand in the most powerful chamber in known space and asked to be taken seriously. How much of that history was shaped by the hope of recognition? How much of our energy had we spent reaching toward the approval of civilizations that had already made up their minds about us before we arrived? And then something had shifted. I had felt the edge of it in that brief government broadcast after the vote. I had sensed its shape in the silence that followed. Now I was traveling toward whatever it had become, and I did not have a clear name for the feeling that produced. On the 14th day of travel, I crossed into the outer region of Sol's gravitational influence. Nothing happened. No signal. No warning. The stars around me looked the same as they always had. But on the 15th day, I received a message. It was short, a set of coordinates, an arrival time, and a name. The name was Nina Vale, Director of External Relations, Earth Unified Directorate. I recognized the name. Nina had been a mid-level interplanetary policy analyst when I had left Earth. Quiet, thorough, the kind of person who read everything twice before forming an opinion. I would not have predicted her as the person standing at the top of whatever Earth had become, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This was not a moment that would have been handled by the loudest voice in the room. I followed the coordinates. They led me to a point just beyond the orbit of Neptune, which I had expected to be roughly empty space with a good view of the outer system. What I found instead was a structure that was not in any of my charts, because it had not existed when my charts were last updated. It was a station, not large by the standards of what I had seen in the Council's territory, nothing like the vast engineering of Sector Prime. But it was clean and precise and clearly new, with a design that was unmistakably human in its geometry, that particular combination of practicality, and the faint insistence on aesthetic consideration that showed up in everything humanity built once it stopped rushing. I docked without difficulty. Nina was waiting on the other side of the airlock. She looked about 10 years older than the last photograph I had in my files, which made sense given the timeline, but there was something else different about her, something less easy to quantify than the gray at her temples or the additional lines near her eyes. She seemed settled in a way I did not remember, like someone who had been in the right place for a long time and had stopped wondering whether they belonged there. She shook my hand. "Kale, it is good to see you." "You have no idea," I said, "what the last 8 months have been like." She smiled. "I have a reasonable idea. We monitored the council's sessions when it suited us. Please come in." The station's interior was comfortable without being elaborate. We sat in a meeting room with a wide viewport that looked out toward the inner system, toward the distant sun. And even from this distance, even through the unenhanced viewport of a modest meeting room, I could see that something was different about the space between Neptune and the sun. A quality of the light, a geometry in the far dark that should not have been there. I looked at it for a moment before I looked back at Nina. "Tell me what happened," I said. "After the vote, tell me from the beginning." She thought about where to start. "You filed your report and we received it. The vote itself was not a surprise. We had modeled the likely outcome and the actual result was close to what we expected." She paused. "What was not in the model was the public response." "I watched the news feeds," I said. "There was less anger than I expected." "There was less anger than we expected too," she said. "And when something surprises you in a model, you pay attention to it. The anger came, but it burned fast. What replaced it was something we had seen fragments of before, but never at this scale. A kind of collective clarity, not about what had gone wrong, but about what needed to happen." She leaned forward slightly. "The council told us we were not good enough. We had heard versions of that before from our own history. And the way humanity has always worked, the way we actually move forward, is not by arguing with the people who underestimate us. It is by showing them." "The quiet years," I said. I had seen the phrase in some of the residual signal data Saris and I had analyzed. "That is what it became known as internally, yes," she nodded. "The decision to go silent was not made by one government or one committee. It emerged from a convergence. Multiple branches of the unified directorate, independently, came to the same conclusion within about 3 weeks of the vote. The logic was simple. Every unit of energy spent on communication with an entity that had already dismissed you was a unit of energy not spent on becoming the thing that would force a reconsideration. And the communications infrastructure, you shut down the navigation beacons. That was deliberate, yes. A calculated risk. We knew it would concern observers. We knew it might provoke exactly the kind of response we saw from the Vreth fleet." She looked at me steadily. "We had prepared for that response." "What you showed that fleet," I said. "The technology that held 200 ships in formation for an hour without damaging any of them. How long had you been developing that?" "The underlying principles had been in theoretical research for about 40 years. What changed was not the science. It was the engineering. When you have the full productive capacity of a species pointed at a single problem without internal resource competition, without duplicated effort across disconnected national programs, Without the delays of politically divided funding, you find out what your species is actually capable of. She paused. We found out. I thought about that, the unity. That is the part I cannot fully explain to myself. Every historical precedent I know suggests that humanity under external pressure fractures rather than consolidates. Political divisions deepen. Competition for limited resources increases. Groups prioritize their own survival over collective goals. That is usually true, she said, but those cases involve a threat. What we experienced after the council vote was not a threat. It was a dismissal. There is a difference. She looked at the viewport for a moment. A threat triggers fear and fear divides. A dismissal, when it is complete enough and public enough and clear enough, triggers something else, especially in a species that has spent its entire history being told what it cannot do. She smiled, and it was not a triumphant smile. It was something quieter than that. We got angry for about 3 weeks, and then we got to work. The asteroid belt, I said. Mars. Processing the asteroid belt gave us the raw materials for the outer system infrastructure. Mars is a terraforming project, Phase 1. The structure near the Sun is a partial Dyson configuration, energy collection. We are at about 15% completion on that. She said all of this with the tone of someone describing a construction project they were fairly satisfied with. There are other projects. Some of them I will show you, and some of them are not ready for an official diplomatic visit. You thought far enough ahead to plan for an official diplomatic visit, I said. We planned for several contingencies, she said. This one was in the middle of the probability range. We expected it would happen within about 2 years. You beat our estimate by several months, which means the fleet response scared them more than we calculated. I sat back and looked at her for a moment. Nina, I have to ask you the question that has been following me for the entire 19 days I was traveling here. I know what you're going to ask, she said. Were you going to come back? I said. If we had not reached out, if the council had continued to ignore the situation, if I had not been sent here, would you eventually have made contact, or were you prepared to simply proceed without the council entirely? She was quiet for long enough that I understood the answer was not simple. We were going to give it approximately 2 more years, she said at last, and then we were going to reach out on our terms with a different kind of opening offer than the one you filed 8 months ago. She met my eyes. Not an application, an introduction. On your terms. On our terms, she said simply. There is a difference. An application asks permission to be recognized. An introduction states that you exist and invites the other party to decide what to do with that information. I thought about the message that had been broadcast to the council fleet, the measured voice, the precise language, the final line. We hope you choose observation. The council sent me here with a letter, I said. It is very careful and says very little. I was not given specific negotiating parameters because the committee responsible for drafting them could not agree on what to ask for. I know, she said. We read it before you docked. I stared at her. Passive signal interception, she said, without any particular embarrassment. We have been monitoring council communications in this region since about month 4 of the quiet years. Nothing invasive, just listening. A pause. We listened to a lot of things. I decided to move past that for the moment. What does Earth want from this meeting? She thought about it with the same careful attention I remembered from her work as an analyst. We do not want membership, she said. Not anymore. The Council, as it currently functions, is a political body structured around the assumption of a certain hierarchy of civilizations. We do not fit that hierarchy anymore, and honestly, I am not sure we ever did in the way they imagined. She folded her hands on the table. What we want is a partnership framework. A new category of relationship that does not exist in the Council's current charter. Not member, not subordinate observer, not provisional curiosity. She said that last phrase with a flatness that told me she had been thinking about it for some time. Partners, with defined mutual obligations, defined zones of cooperation, and clearly negotiated limits on interference in each other's internal affairs. The Council will find that difficult, I said. Their entire structure is built on a hierarchy. What you are describing is lateral. Yes, she said. It will require them to change something they have not changed in a very long time, and they will resist it. She looked at me directly. That is why we need you specifically for this, Kale. Not just because you are the human the Council knows, because you have spent 8 months watching them be afraid, and you understand what that fear is made of, and you know which arguments have a chance of finding the edges of it. I looked at the viewport again, at the faint geometry of something vast and human in the distance. I thought about the Council chamber, about 47 species going quiet at the same moment, about Drawn's still face and the absence of laughter in it. I thought about standing at a podium being laughed at, and what it had felt like, and what it had cost to stand there with my hands behind my back and my expression professional, and my chest tight with something I had not allowed to reach my face. And I thought about coming back to that same podium and watching those same faces look at me with something different in them. Not admiration, not yet, but the beginning of the recognition that the story they had been telling themselves about what humanity was had been built on incomplete information, and now the information was complete, and the story needed rewriting. I will need a full briefing on what I am authorized to offer, I said. I will need complete documentation of Earth's current capabilities, in general terms that can be shared with the Council without revealing anything you are not ready to reveal. I will need to understand the partnership framework in enough detail to answer questions about it under pressure. I paused. And I will need to know what your absolute minimum acceptable outcome is, so that I know the floor of the negotiation. Of course, Nina said. We have prepared all of that. We expected it would take about 3 days to brief you thoroughly. 3 days, I said. And then, she said, you go back and you open the door. I nodded slowly. They will not make this easy. No, she agreed. But you already know they can afford to make it difficult a lot less than they think they can. We sat for a moment in the quiet of that room, with the viewport between us and the restructured inner system of Earth's solar neighborhood, and I felt something settle in me that had been shifting and uncertain for 8 months. I thought about the moment the Council fleet had been held in formation, not destroyed, not damaged, not humiliated in any lasting way, held precisely for exactly the time needed to make the point and then released cleanly. That was the detail that had stayed with me above all others, the precision of restraint, the choice to stop at demonstration rather than go further. That was not the behavior of a civilization that was angry. That was the behavior of a civilization that had decided exactly what it wanted and exactly how much force was appropriate to use in the process of getting it. No more, no less. I thought about what Nina had said. We got angry for about 3 weeks, and then we got to work. 18 years of diplomatic experience, and I was not sure I had ever seen a better summary of what made a civilization genuinely formidable. 3 days later, I boarded my courier vessel and headed back toward Council space. The briefing documents were encrypted in my data archive. The partnership framework was detailed and precise and in places surprisingly generous. Earth was not looking to dominate the Council. It was not looking for revenge. It was looking for a relationship of equals, which was, in its own way, the most radical thing it could have asked for. On the last day of the return journey, I opened my personal log one more time. I had been writing in it for 8 months. Pages and pages of observation and uncertainty, and the peculiar loneliness of being the only representative of your species in a room full of people who do not take your species seriously. I read back through some of it and I was surprised, in a distant way, by how much of it had been written in a kind of quiet disbelief, not at the Council's dismissal, at Earth's response to it. I had expected my people to be wounded. I had expected noise and outrage and the kind of political theater that follows any major public humiliation. I had not expected silence. I had not expected focus. I had not expected this. I wrote the final entry for that 8-month period, and then I sat for a while looking at the words. They were not polished words, not the kind you would put in a formal document, but they were honest, which felt like the right note to end on. I wrote, "They laughed because they thought silence meant absence. That is the oldest mistake made by the powerful about the patient. Silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is the sound of everything necessary being done before the conversation resumes. My people went quiet because they had something to build and they built it, and now they are ready to speak again. Not as applicants, not as supplicants, not as a provisional curiosity, as themselves." I looked at the words for a while. Then I closed the log and began preparing my remarks for the council floor. I was going to stand at that podium for the 3rd time, and this time I was not going to be asking for anything. I was going to be making an offer. And if the history of the past 8 months had taught me anything, it was that when humanity made a genuine offer from a position of genuine strength, the only wrong answer was the one that had already been given. They had already given that answer once. I did not think they would make the same mistake again.